This is Sue Jackson of the Live with ME CFS blog. And I'm here today simply to tell you my family's story of our journey with chronic illness over the last 19 years. I was sort of assuming that everyone already knew my story because I've written that blog, Live with ME CFS, for 14 years now, more than 14 years. I'll include a link down below if you want to check it out. So I've had the blog for a long time. I've interacted with a lot of patients and caregivers and other chronic illness bloggers online, on Twitter, on the Facebook page for my blog, in lots of different groups, patient groups especially. So I kind of just thought everybody knew my story, but I am relatively new to YouTube. So I thought it would be worthwhile to take a few minutes and let you know where I'm coming from, where we've been, and, where we are right now. So besides the blog, I've also written a book, Finding a New Normal, Living Your Best Life with Chronic Illness. And that is the story I'm about to tell you. Our story is also at the beginning of the book. So let's start with the before. Our lives definitely were split very clearly into a before and an after, as I suppose is true for many with chronic illness. So back at the beginning of 2002, my family was living a very typical, busy, active life. My husband and I had 2 young sons. They were just 4 and 7 at the time. And we were busy, they were in school and preschool. We took vacations, we went camping. We loved the outdoors. That was our main thing to do as a family, was hiking and camping and canoeing. And we'd been taking the boys with us since they were infants. So by the ages of 4 and 7, they loved hiking just as much as we did. We had taken our older son on his first backpacking trip when he was 3 years old, right about the time I found out I was pregnant with our second son. So early 2002, we were planning on another backpacking trip, which would have been the first for our younger son. So then on March 1st, 2002, we had a pretty typically busy Saturday. I did an exercise class at the Y while my sons were in their swim classes. I went to the grocery store, spent most of the day cleaning the house because we were having friends over that night. We had, I made a big dinner for our friends and their 3 kids. The kids were all running around making noise and being crazy, and the adults were catching up, and, we had a nice evening with them. But by the time I went to bed that night, I was feeling unusually tired, and I had a little bit of a sore throat, but I just chalked it up to having such a busy day. Well, I woke up the next morning, March 2nd, 2002, just feeling horrible. Severe sore throat. It felt like I had swallowed barbed wire. It even hurt to swallow water. I was exhausted. I was achy all over. I figured I had the flu. So like many people with ME CFS, which I would eventually be diagnosed with, it did start that abruptly. I know the exact date, and many of us are in that boat. So anyway, on March 2nd, 2002, we had plans that day to take a day trip with our boys down to Baltimore, which is about an hour away from where we live here in Delaware. And even though I was feeling so awful, I convinced myself, no, we've made this plan for a long time. We should go ahead with it. Took the boys out to breakfast, drove down to Baltimore. That whole day is like, I was in a fog all day. I felt so horrible. I can remember being in the Baltimore Aquarium the National Aquarium in Baltimore, and just barely being able to stand on my feet. And I couldn't understand why I was so weak and exhausted. I mean, I was literally holding myself up with the handrail through some of the rooms in the aquarium. I was also sucking on hard candies all day because my throat hurt so badly. So that was the start. What followed, I thought it was a flu, but of course it never went away. And what followed was a year of exhaustion and pain and agony and having no idea what was wrong with me. I know this is similar to many other people's stories. I went from one doctor to the next. I saw probably a dozen or more specialists that year. No one could tell me what was wrong with me. I had hundreds and hundreds of lab tests done. They all came back normal, something that when you're searching for a diagnosis, you really don't want to hear. And, that year just passed in a cloud. Finally, about a year after I first got sick, in March 2003, I finally got a diagnosis. I'd been searching for a new primary care doctor, and the one that we chose, mostly because she was very close to us and was accepting new patients, she knew what I had right away. On my very first visit to her, when I've got an engineering background, so I'm very analytical, I came in with a binder full of lab results and graphs and charts showing, this is how I used to feel, this is how I feel now. One of the things that really confused me was the ups and downs. I did have days that year when I had felt fine, like my old self, but then they'd be followed by days when I felt even worse. And I showed her the graphs of these ups and downs. Fortunately, I didn't know it at the time, but I had stumbled upon one of the very few local doctors who actually understood ME/CFS and knew what it was. So in that first visit, she asked me if I wanted more lab tests, and I said yes, because she mentioned something called chronic fatigue syndrome. And I thought, that doesn't sound real. I want a real diagnosis. So I said, yes, I want more tests. Well, those tests came back normal. And at that point, she said, I'm pretty sure that you have chronic fatigue syndrome. And she explained some things to me about it. And I finally agreed with her. And then she said, well, are you ready to try some treatments? Which kind of blew my mind. So, like I said, I was lucky to have stumbled onto one of the very few doctors who actually knew what it was and knew how to treat it. So just a little background in case you're not familiar with it. Chronic fatigue syndrome is the cringe-inducing misnomer that the CDC saddled us with back in the 80s. They acted like they were discovering something brand new, but the rest of the world already knew about this disease and called it myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME. So these days, the CDC is clinging to that chronic fatigue syndrome name. Most people now recognize that it is the same as ME, and so very often now you'll hear the term ME/CFS, combining those two terms. So that's what I was diagnosed with in 2003. My doctor did know the basics about how to treat it. She started by correcting my sleep. She said, sleep dysfunction's at the heart of this, and if you fix your sleep, everything else will get better. And she was right. So we started there. She's wonderful still to this day, and I'm so lucky to have found her. So, we started to kind of get used to this. I was thrilled to have a name for what was happening to me, but of course I was devastated to find out that I had a chronic illness with no known cure. the thought that this was my life now forever just blew my mind. But, we tried to make our peace with that. Then, a couple of years later, the unthinkable happened. When our sons were 6 and 10, both at the same time developed the same symptoms of ME/CFS. Now, this is not at all unusual. It does have, there's a genetic predisposition behind it. Scientists are at work now to identify the exact genes involved, but we know that genetics are involved, and it is very common for it to run in families. Very common to find multiple family members with ME/CFS. So, but these were our children. They were only 6 and 10. And to see them with some of the same devastating symptoms that I had struggled with and was still struggling with was just devastating for us. We were in denial for a little while, despite knowing what it looked like. But within 6 months, our older son was officially diagnosed with ME/CFS. We took him to the top pediatric ME/CFS expert in the world at the time, the wonderful Dr. David Bell, who's unfortunately now retired. And he commented that it was amazing to him how similar our diseases were between my son and I, and that my son definitely did have ME/CFS. It's difficult to diagnose because there aren't any lab tests or diagnostic, very black and white diagnostics for it. But the major diagnostic criteria for ME/CFS is an intolerance to exertion, something the CDC calls post-exertional malaise, which again, is not, it doesn't sound that bad, and it's really horrible. What it means, bottom line, is that even mild exertion can leave you what we call crashed the next day, or even 2 days later, or maybe just an hour later. The parameters vary depending on the severity of your disease and how you react. But this is the primary way that it's diagnosed. And that's how my doctor knew it. When I showed her that graph of the ups and downs, saying some days I feel fine and I go back to my normal life, and then a day or two later, I feel terrible again. That is classic ME/CFS. It's that exertion intolerance at work. So Dr. Bell diagnosed my son. Our younger son, we talked to Dr. Bell about him, but his symptoms were milder than mine and my older son's. They were also more intermittent. He had more good days, and it took more to make him crash. So he was only in first grade at that time. So Dr. Bell very wisely told us that he recommended waiting on an official diagnosis. So 2 years later, when he was in third grade, and his principal called asking us why he had already missed 35 days of school that school year, that's when we officially diagnosed him. But in the meantime, that first visit with Dr. Bell, the other thing we found out was that he tested my older son for orthostatic intolerance while we were in the office. You can do a simple standing test for this, which is actually very accurate. So let me back up for a minute. Orthostatic intolerance, or OI, is also sometimes referred to as dysautonomia, which basically means your autonomic nervous system is not working properly. OI is an integral part of ME/CFS. Studies show that at least 97% of patients have at least one form of it. But we didn't know anything about it. And when Dr. Bell first explained it to me in the office visit that day, I said, "Oh yeah, I've read about that. Neither of us have it." And he kind of smiled and nodded his head, and then did the test of my son in the office. And I was stunned watching that test, which consists of 10 minutes of lying down. You take blood pressure and heart rate, and then the patient stands up, stands perfectly still, leaning against a wall or other hard surface, not even wiggling fingers or toes, just perfectly still for 10 minutes. So, you might think standing for 10 minutes, no big deal. But my son didn't even make it the full 10 minutes. He turned purple. His feet were purple. It was January in Western New York, which is where I grew up. So I can tell you it's very cold at that time of year. And my son was sweating and hot and telling us that he felt sick and uncomfortable. And meanwhile, the nurse was taking his blood pressure and heart rate at 1-minute intervals. So like I said, he didn't even make the full 10 minutes. As soon as he hit the criteria, Dr. Bell stopped the test and let him lie down. And he looked at me and said, "You have OI too, but if I test you, you're not going to be able to get the two of you home today." So that was a big turning point for us, learning about OI. Because as it turns out, treating OI makes a huge difference in almost all symptoms. So that was a good thing for us to learn. And we did almost immediately begin working on treatment for my son. I kind of focused on him first. It took a few more years for me to treat myself. But when I did, it was amazing. It makes a big difference in your life. It allows you to be more active without crashing. So it actually reduces that exercise intolerance, improves your tolerance of exertion. And the forms of OI that my son has and that I have are POTS, where the heart rate goes very high while you're upright, and neurally mediated hypotension, where the blood pressure drops low while you're upright. So there are medications that can help to stabilize your blood pressure, reduce your heart rate to more normal levels. Florinef worked great for my son. It's actually what got him back to school full time, allowed him to rejoin the school band in middle school. He even began playing soccer again. So he still had limits. He definitely still had ME/CFS, but treating OI made a huge difference. And as I said, a couple years later, we also diagnosed my younger son, and at that time started treating his orthostatic intolerance as well. And since his ME/CFS was milder, treating OI really made him symptom-free about 90% of the time. He'd still crash, but it took a lot. So he couldn't play 2 soccer games in a row. He couldn't do a sleepover on a Saturday night because it wouldn't be enough time to recover before school Monday. But for the most part, treating OI helped both boys. And as I said, a few years later, it helped me as well. And meanwhile, I was still working with my primary care physician on other treatments, and my older son and I had begun to see, besides Dr. Bell, once he retired, we began to see Dr. Susan Levine in New York City, who's one of the top ME/CFS doctors in the world. So she helped us with new treatments as well. So over the next decade or so, with the help of these wonderful doctors and lots of different treatments, we began to improve and be able to live our lives again. Before we got to that point, when both boys were sick and I was sick, my husband was the only one in our family of 4 that was still healthy. Those were pretty dark days. That was a very difficult time for us. We were, there were lots of days when 3 of the 4 of us were completely crashed, depleted, lying in couches and on the floor of the family room, not able to do anything. The boys missed a lot of school. But eventually, with the help of treatments, things began to improve for us. So we'll flash forward now to the present. Our younger son, who, as I said, his illness was always milder, and Dr. Bell had told us that with that kind of mild, intermittent ME/CFS, there was a good chance, especially having gotten it so young, that there was a good chance he would fully recover. And he did. So by age 16, he was fully recovered. He asked if he could stop the Florinef, and he came off of that with no problems at all. And, you know, he's great. He's 23 now, perfectly healthy, working full time, you know, just living a very active and healthy life. Our older son, who is now 27, he's had some really difficult times. I skipped a big part of our story. My older son and I both also have tick infections. So mine's the easier part. In 2008, I had sudden onset of severe knee pain, which had never bothered me before, and nausea at the same time. Those are two key symptoms of Lyme disease. Not necessarily knee pain, but some sort of joint pain. It can be any joint in the body. It can move from one joint to another. But for me, it was knee pain and nausea. I started treating it. I ended up on antibiotics for more than 3 years because ME/CFS is at its heart an immune disorder. And so that made it harder for my body to fight the Lyme disease. It's been 13 years now since my Lyme diagnosis. I am still battling it. I thought it was under control. And then toward the end of 2019 and definitely at the beginning of 2020, I went into a terrible relapse. And it took me a year to figure this out. But in January 2021, I realized that a big piece of that relapse was my Lyme disease relapsing. It never really went away. It was hiding in my body. And so I started seeing a new Lyme specialist this year. She's been helping me with some new treatments, which are really helping. So I'm dealing with both ME/CFS and Lyme. My son's case was a little more complicated. As I said, once we learned about orthostatic intolerance and began treating it, we saw huge improvement in him. And he was back in school. He was doing great. In spring of 7th grade, he suddenly worsened. And, like me, had a sudden onset of knee pain. Now, fortunately, he actually tested positive for Lyme. Not everyone does. I don't. Not everyone makes the antibodies. And the Lyme bacteria doesn't stay in the bloodstream. It hides in tissues and joints, causing the joint pain. But my son did have a positive Lyme test, so his pediatrician began treating him. He took 6 weeks of antibiotics, and his new acute symptoms, like the knee pain, did clear up mostly, but he was left with more fatigue and less energy, and he wasn't quite back to that great baseline he had gotten to earlier that school year with the treatment of OI. Well, we just chalked it up to ME/CFS. We didn't know any better. It took us over 3 years to finally realize that our son also had 2 other tick infections. Ticks carry a variety of infections, not just Lyme disease. These are sometimes called co-infections. And I finally heard something from other parents that made me realize that he had at least one of these co-infections. We took him to a Lyme specialist and found out that he still had Lyme, because if you've got co-infections left untreated, you can't get rid of Lyme. And he now had babesia, which is a single-celled organism, a paramecium, and bartonella, which is another bacteria. but it responds to different treatments than Lyme, even though they're both different forms of bacteria. So with that new knowledge, he began treatment for all 3 tick infections. And that began over the previous 3 years. He had gotten much, much, much worse as the infections took hold in his body. But after that much time, they were difficult, if not impossible, to get rid of. He had a lot of ups and downs. There were times when he was doing better. He did start college on time with his peers, but he was only able to take 3 classes at a time. He kind of hit bottom again just after college in 2019. And we went to see a new Lyme specialist. We loved our old one, but this one was a little closer to us. And she and a functional medicine specialist started my son on some new treatments. They did more testing, discovered he was severely gluten intolerant, which we didn't know. Discovered that he had severe GI problems by that time. They ran some tests and found like a dozen different nasty pathogens that aren't supposed to be there in his GI tract. So with treatment and continuing treatment for Lyme, bartonella, and babesia, as well as all of his treatments for ME/CFS, over the past 2 years, he's made great strides. So he is 27 now. He's living with his girlfriend, so he was able to move out and live independently. He just got a summer internship this year, so that's great news. And he's working almost 30 hours a week, sometimes more than that, and he's managing it. So if you've got a child with these illnesses, you know what a miracle that is, and we're thrilled for him. As for me, that relapse that began in early 2020, I thought I was out of it earlier this year. I'm not fully out of it. The better Lyme treatments have helped me tremendously. I just found out I've also got some mold in my system, so I'm starting treatment for that. My energy and stamina are not quite back to where they were before this relapse began in March 2020. So still working on that. I had gotten to the point where my stamina was quite good. And despite the exertion intolerance of ME/CFS, with treatment, I was able to walk or hike with my husband, sometimes for up to 1.5 to 2 miles, which is a lot for someone with these illnesses. I was doing quite well, so I want to get back to that point, and I'm working on it. So that is our story. Just one final point about the title of my book. About 6 weeks after my first baby was born, I was at my checkup with my OBGYN, and I was still wearing maternity jeans, and I was really discouraged. And, I said to her, when is life going to return to normal? And she, who also had children of her own, just kind of smiled and said very kindly, well, it's a new normal now. And, that's what life with chronic illness is. It's a new normal. You can find a way to accept where you are and live a life with joy and satisfaction. That's what the book's all about. And that's kind of where we are now. I mean, even during this bad period, the last 1.5 years, we are living our lives, and I try to find joy in every day. So that's my story. Please let me know down below what your story is, if you've got any questions for me, and what else you would like to hear about on this channel.